When 58-year-old Robert Martinez answered, "A soldier's heart," to what takes time to heal, his voice carried the weight of 3 decades spent carrying wounds that no one could see. But it wasn't just his answer that stopped Steve Harvey cold. It was the way he said it, with the haunted certainty of someone who had learned that some battles continue long after the war ends. The cameras kept rolling, but this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was the moment when America met one of its forgotten warriors, proving that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is admit that coming home was just the beginning of the fight. Tuesday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta began with quiet dignity from the Martinez family. They were from San Antonio, Texas, a military town that understood both the honor of service and the cost of sacrifice. Robert Martinez looked like someone who had learned to carry himself with discipline despite carrying burdens that threatened to break him. Medium height with silver-streaked hair cut in military style, he wore a simple blue button-down shirt with careful attention to appearance. His eyes held depths that seemed to contain stories he had spent 30 years keeping to himself. Standing beside him was his wife Carmen Martinez, 55, a retired schoolteacher, whose patient, protective presence suggested someone who had spent decades learning to love a man who couldn't always explain why some days were harder than others. Completing their family were their adult children, Miguel, 32, a high school coach who had inherited his father's quiet strength, and Sophia, 28, a nurse whose gentle competence spoke of someone who had learned early that healing required both skill and compassion. What the studio audience couldn't know was the journey that had brought him to this moment. 58 years old, and he had never spoken publicly about the 18 months that had defined the rest of his life. Vietnam, 1968–1969, when he was 19 and believed that serving his country was the most honorable thing a young man could do. Robert's war had begun with youthful idealism and ended with knowledge that aged a teenager into an old man. He had enlisted rather than waiting to be drafted, proud to follow his father who had served in World War II and come home to parades. But Robert's war was different. Vietnam divided a nation, and soldiers like Robert came home not to celebrations but to protests, not to gratitude but to shame. The 18 months in Southeast Asia had been survival training, both physical and psychological. Robert had seen friends die, been forced to make life and death decisions that haunted him decades later. He learned to sleep with one eye open, carry hypervigilance that served him in combat but made civilian life feel like constant threat assessment. Coming home had been harder than going to war. The young man who had left San Antonio with purpose returned hollow-eyed and changed. There were no parades for Vietnam veterans, no welcome home celebrations. Instead, there were protesters at airports, people who spat on uniforms, and a general sense that the war Robert had fought was something the country wanted to forget. The adjustment to civilian life had been brutal. Robert had struggled with insomnia, startling at unexpected sounds, feeling uncomfortable in crowds, and experiencing flashbacks. But in 1970 there was no name for what he was experiencing, no recognition that the psychological wounds of war were as real as physical injuries. PTSD wouldn't be officially recognized until 1980, more than a decade after Robert had returned. By then, he had learned to cope through silence, discipline, and determination to provide for his family despite the war that continued inside his head. He found work as a mechanic, married Carmen who understood that his silences weren't rejections but protection, and built a life that looked normal while requiring constant internal management. For 30 years, Robert had been the strong, silent patriarch of his family. He had never missed a day of work, never failed to provide for his wife and children, never allowed his internal struggles to become their burden. But the cost had been enormous. He had lived with chronic hypervigilance, depression, anxiety, and a sense of disconnection that made it difficult to fully engage with the life he had built. His children had grown up with a father who loved them but seemed unreachable, who could fix any mechanical problem but couldn't explain why he sometimes stared into space. Carmen had learned to recognize the signs, the nights when sleep wouldn't come, the days when crowds felt overwhelming. The decision to apply for Family Feud had been Carmen's idea, part of her ongoing effort to help Robert connect with experiences that brought joy rather than pain. She had submitted their application with a note that revealed nothing about Robert's military service, but emphasized their strong family bond and their desire to create positive memories together. The trip to Atlanta had been Robert's first significant travel since his military service, challenging in ways his family didn't fully understand. Airports triggered memories. Crowds activated his hypervigilance. During family introductions, Steve had approached them with his characteristic warmth, immediately noticing something distinctive about Robert's bearing and the way his family seemed protective of him. "The Martinez family from San Antonio, military town. Y'all ready to play some Family Feud?" Carmen stepped forward as the family spokesperson, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had learned to advocate for her family with grace. "We're absolutely ready, Steve. This is my husband Robert, our son Miguel, and our daughter Sophia." Steve approached Robert with respectful interest, recognizing something in the older man's posture that spoke of military training. "Robert, San Antonio, that's military country. Did you serve?" Robert's response was immediate, but carried the careful control of someone who had learned to keep certain doors closed. "Yes, sir, Mr. Harvey. Army, Vietnam, 1968 to 19... Something in the way Robert stated his service, with pride but also with a weight that suggested complex feelings about that time, caught Steve's attention. He looked more closely at this man who spoke about military service with the precision of someone for whom those experiences remained vivid and significant. "Thank you for your service, Robert," Steve said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "Welcome home." The words "welcome home" hit Robert in a way that Steve couldn't have anticipated. For 30 years, no one had said those words to him. Vietnam veterans had been denied the homecoming recognition that earlier generations of warriors had received, and Robert's throat tightened slightly at hearing the greeting he had never received as a 19-year-old returning from war. The game progressed well through the first 4 rounds. The Martinez family was coordinated and supportive, with Carmen gently managing the team dynamics, while Miguel and Sophia provided energy and enthusiasm. Robert had participated quietly but effectively, giving thoughtful answers that showed both intelligence and a perspective shaped by experiences that went beyond typical family life. During commercial breaks, production assistants noticed the family's careful attention to Robert's comfort level, the way Carmen would check his emotional state with subtle glances, and the obvious respect his children showed for their father despite mind, or perhaps because of, his quiet nature. When asked to name something that makes you proud, Robert had answered, "My family," earning both points and appreciative looks from Steve, who was beginning to sense that this veteran's relationship with pride was complex and hard-earned. But it was during the 5th round that everything changed. The category that appeared on the board seemed straightforward enough: name something that takes time to heal. Robert had been selected to answer, his first time approaching the podium alone during the entire game. He walked forward with the precise bearing of someone whose military training had never left him, and something in his expression suggested this question carried personal weight that went far beyond game show strategy. Steve read the question with his usual enthusiasm, expecting typical responses about physical injuries, broken hearts, or family disputes. "Robert, here we go. Name something that takes time to heal." Robert paused for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 decades spent learning that some wounds aren't visible but never stop bleeding. "A soldier's heart." The studio fell completely silent. Not the brief pause of audience consideration, but the profound quiet that comes when people suddenly understand they have just heard something that cuts to the heart of sacrifice, service, and the cost of protecting freedom. Steve's expression shifted immediately. In decades of hosting, he had heard thousands of answers from contestants of all ages, but something in Robert's tone, the personal knowledge, the hard-earned wisdom, the quiet pain, told him this was more than just a game show response. "A soldier's heart," Steve repeated slowly, studying Robert's face and beginning to understand that this answer came from lived experience that most people could never imagine. Robert nodded, his military composure steady despite the emotional weight of what he was about to share. "Yes, sir, Mr. Harvey. I came back from Vietnam in 1969, and I'm still working on healing some of the things I saw and did over there. A soldier's heart, it carries a lot." The revelation hit the studio like a physical force. The audience, which moments before had been engaged in typical game show energy, now sat in recognition of something far more significant than they had expected to witness. "Tell me about that, Robert," Steve said gently, walking closer to where he stood at the podium and completely abandoning the game show format. Robert straightened slightly, drawing on reserves of strength that had carried him through 3 decades of silent struggle. "Mr. Harvey, I was 19 when I went to Vietnam. Thought I was going to save the world, serve my country, come home a hero like my dad did after World War II. But Vietnam was different. We came home to a country that didn't want to talk about what we'd done or what had been done to us." The studio was completely silent now. Even the production crew had stopped their usual activity, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a veteran finally speaking about experiences he had kept locked away for 30 years. "What was that like?" Steve asked softly. Robert's voice grew stronger as he shared experiences he had never discussed publicly. "Hard, Mr. Harvey, real hard. I saw friends die, had to do things that no teenager should have to do. Came home and people acted like I should just forget about it, go back to normal life. But there wasn't any normal life after what I'd seen." Behind him, Carmen was emotional, understanding for the first time the full weight of what her husband had carried silently throughout their marriage. Miguel and Sofia were learning details about their father's service that he had never shared, finally understanding why some days had been harder for him than others. "How did you cope?" Steve continued, his voice carrying the respect due to someone who had sacrificed for his country. "Mostly by not talking about it," Robert replied with complete honesty. "Worked, took care of my family, tried to push it down deep, but a soldier's heart doesn't forget, Mr. Harvey. The faces, the sounds, the fear, it all stays with you. Some days are better than others, but it's always there." The wisdom in those words, coming from someone who had spent decades learning to live with invisible wounds while serving his family with the same dedication he had shown his country, left everyone in the studio profoundly moved. Steve Harvey, who had hosted thousands of shows and met countless contestants, found himself facing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a veteran sharing his story. This was a man who had carried the weight of service and sacrifice for 30 years while asking nothing in return, who had protected his family from his pain while never receiving the recognition or support he deserved. "Robert," Steve said, his voice carrying unusual gravity, "I need to ask you something. In all these years, has anyone ever properly thanked you for what you went through, not just for serving, but for carrying that burden so the rest of us didn't have to?" Robert's composure cracked slightly, his eyes filling with tears that he had held back for decades. "No, sir, Mr. Harvey. Most people don't want to hear about Vietnam. Can't say I blame them. It wasn't a popular war. What happened next would break every Family Feud protocol and create one of the most powerful moments in television history." "Stop the clocks," Steve called out, his voice carrying across the studio with unprecedented authority. "Stop everything. This man deserves more than a game show answer." The game show timers froze. The music cut out, the audience held its collective breath as they recognized they were witnessing something far more significant than entertainment. Steve walked to the center of the stage, positioning himself so he could address the entire studio while staying close to Robert. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve began, his voice carrying a gravity that transformed the atmosphere, "we just heard from someone who gave his youth, his innocence, and 30 years of his life to serve this country. We just met a man who went to war as a teenager and came home carrying wounds that no one wanted to acknowledge." He gestured toward Robert. "This man right here didn't just serve in Vietnam, he's been serving ever since, serving his family, his community, carrying the weight of experiences that most of us can't imagine, asking for nothing in return." The audience remained silent, but their attention was absolute, recognizing they were in the presence of someone whose sacrifice had been overlooked for far too long. "Robert Martinez," Steve said, turning to face him directly, "you served your country when your country needed you. You came home to a nation that didn't know how to thank you, and you've spent 30 years healing in silence while continuing to serve your family with the same dedication you showed in uniform." Robert was openly emotional now, 3 decades of unacknowledged pain and sacrifice, finally being recognized by someone who understood its value. Steve walked closer to Robert, his voice growing more passionate. "And I need everyone in this studio and everyone watching at home to understand something. This man and thousands of veterans like him didn't just fight for our freedom overseas. They've been fighting for their own peace at home, dealing with wounds we couldn't see, trauma we didn't understand, pain we didn't want to acknowledge." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. "Robert," he said, "this has my personal phone number on it. Because what you've shared with us today isn't just personal history. It's a reminder that our veterans deserve more than just one day of recognition a year. They deserve support, understanding, and acknowledgement that their service didn't end when they came home." But Steve wasn't done. He began removing his suit jacket, the gesture that had become his signature in moments of profound recognition. "This jacket," Steve said, approaching Robert carefully and draping it around his shoulders, "goes home with someone who has served this country with honor for 50 years, 38 months in uniform and 50 years carrying the weight of that service." Someone who has shown us that real strength isn't about never being wounded, it's about continuing to serve despite the wounds. The jacket transformed Robert's appearance, giving him the look of someone whose service had finally been properly acknowledged and honored. Steve turned to address the entire studio again. "You know what we're going to do? We're going to finish this game, but more importantly, we're going to make sure Robert gets connected with the support services he's earned through his service. And we're going to remember that when we see veterans struggling, they're not broken, they're warriors dealing with the cost of keeping the rest of us safe." As the show concluded, Steve made an unprecedented announcement. His foundation would provide funding for comprehensive PTSD treatment for Robert, connecting him with specialized veteran services and support groups where he could continue the healing process he had begun that day. But the most powerful moment came when Steve addressed Robert directly, one final time. "Robert," he said, "I want you to look right into that camera and tell every veteran watching who might be struggling alone that it's okay to ask for help." Robert looked directly into the main camera, his 58-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about service and sacrifice. "To every veteran out there who's been carrying this alone," he said, "I want you to know that you're not broken, you're not weak. What you're feeling is the cost of serving something bigger than yourself. And it's okay to get help. It's okay to talk about it. You served your country with honor, and you deserve to live with peace." His voice grew steadier as he continued. "Don't wait 30 years like I did. There are people who understand, people who want to help. You earned that help the day you put on the uniform. Use it." Behind the cameras, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Crew members who had worked on hundreds of episodes found themselves witnessing something that transcended entertainment and touched the realm of national healing. As the show concluded, something unprecedented happened. Military families and veteran service organizations in the studio audience began approaching Robert not for autographs or photos, but to share their own stories of service, sacrifice, and the long journey toward healing. Robert's courage in speaking about his experience had created a community of understanding that proved he was not alone in his struggle. The episode that aired 16 weeks later became one of the most impactful in Family Feud history. Not because of dramatic moments or unexpected twists, but because of the profound moment when a forgotten warrior finally found his voice and reminded a nation that freedom isn't free, and those who pay the price deserve more than our gratitude. They deserve our support. The response was overwhelming. The show received over 500,000 messages from viewers, many from veterans and military families sharing their own stories of service, sacrifice, and the long journey toward healing. Veteran service organizations reported significant increases in contact from veterans seeking help. PTSD awareness campaigns saw unprecedented engagement. Steve Harvey said in interviews that Robert's episode changed how he understood both service and sacrifice. "I met a man that day who taught me that coming home from war is just the beginning of a veteran's service to their country," he explained. "Robert showed me that some of our bravest warriors have been fighting their hardest battles in silence, and it's time we started acknowledging that fight." Robert Martinez is now 59, attending regular therapy sessions and participating in veteran support groups. With the mental health support from Steve's foundation, he has begun to process trauma that he carried alone for 3 decades. He speaks regularly at veteran events, sharing his message that seeking help is not surrender, but another form of service. The lesson Robert Martinez taught that Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta is profound. Strength isn't about carrying every burden alone, it's about having the courage to admit when you need help carrying them. Sometimes the most heroic thing a warrior can do is lay down their armor long enough to heal the wounds it was protecting. And sometimes it takes a 58-year-old Vietnam veteran with an oversized suit jacket and 3 decades of silent struggle to remind a television studio full of people that freedom isn't free, that those who pay the price deserve our support, and that a soldier's heart can heal, but only when we acknowledge it was wounded in service to something greater than ourselves. Because that's what service looks like, that's what sacrifice sounds like, and that's what happens when a game show becomes a platform for understanding that some of the strongest people on earth are the ones who've been fighting battles we couldn't see, carrying burdens we didn't understand, and serving their country long after they took off the uniform.